Yes, good morning and good afternoon to you all, and good evening from some parts of the world. We'll be starting shortly. Give us just about 1 minute and we should kickstart this webinar. Thank you for bearing with us as we wait for more participants to just log in. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and start. Once again, you're most welcome to this webinar, Strengthening the Regulatory Role in the Water and Sanitation Sector, hosted by the African Development Bank and the SAWAS Regulators Association. The discussions today are focused on the findings from a joint study by the African Development Bank and SAWAS Regulators Association on improving sector financing. The presentations and speakers today will showcase the need for strengthened policies, strengthened institutions, and enhanced regulation, which all play a critical role in attracting financing. A conceptual framework from planning, implementation, monitoring, and impact will be presented, and a panel discussion will provide practical insights. This webinar is being recorded, and recording and the presentation will be shared to all participants. So please bear with us, and we shall have welcome remarks shortly, which will be followed by two presentations and then a panel discussion. Please use the chat box to introduce yourself, and please let us know, of course, which organization you are representing, you are part of. Please feel free to post any and all questions, and these questions will be handled during the Q&A session. We have interpretation in both French and English, so please use the channel that is best suited to you. So at this point, I would like to start the webinar by inviting Mr. Minchera Chirwa, who is the Acting Director of Water and Sanitation at the African Development Bank, for his welcome remarks. Mr. Minchera, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining. It is a pleasure for the African Development Bank to cooperate in this joint webinar with the SAWAS, the Eastern and Southern Africa Water Regulators Association. And we look forward to a very engaging, enlightening, and learning experience over the next hour or two as we discuss this very critical and important subject of regulation in the water sector. But before I make my remarks, allow me to make a note on the loss that we've had recently in the African Development Bank of one of our staff, our key staff, Emmanuel Olet. He was our chief water officer and was key in preparation for this webinar, in organizing it. He passed on the 29th of June suddenly. So before I make my remarks, please allow me just to request that we take a pause, a minute pause, just to respect and remember our friend. So just for a minute. Thank you. Thank you very much. I will now proceed to make some welcome remarks. As introduced by Joanne, this is a webinar which is organized jointly between SOAS and the African Development Bank. It is a very important webinar as we discuss how to scale up financing for water and sanitation sector in Africa. As we know that a lot of our targets to achieve, SDG objectives, and also, a number of our own visions continentally at a country level are behind schedule. And there are a number of reasons for that. Partly, it's underinvestment. We are aware, or most of us are aware, that in order to meet SDG 6 targets alone, we need to be investing at least 4% of our GDP into the sector. I mean, current investments, average around 0.5% GDP, especially in sub-Saharan African countries. We're currently investing in the continent about $13 to $15 billion a year in the sector, which is way below the levels that we need to invest. I think gives us a gap in excess of 40 to 50 billion in terms of the investment requirements. Much of the current investment, about 60 to 70%, is provided by governments, so the public sector. We have financing coming in from partners, ODA, and a little bit from the private sector. And this is obviously way below where it should be to be able to close the financing gap and achieve significant impact in terms of addressing the targets that we have. Regulation obviously plays a very key role in the coordination and operation of the sector. It enables good quality regulation, enables improvement in the performance of water utilities and water service providers, but also enabling the setting of pricing tariffs for water and sanitation based on market and economic parameters. A good and well-grounded legal regulatory framework for the sector also makes it easier or enables investment to flow. And the whole objective of trying to scale up private sector investment cannot make progress without sound regulatory framework in place, but also institutions that are well structured and capable to deliver on their mandates. So this subject becomes an interesting subject, and as indicated, the webinar today will be supported by some background work, analytical work, a study that's been undertaken, with focus in the 3 countries, Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia, to share some lessons or outcomes out of that study. I mean, for the bank, this subject of enhancing regulation is an important one, is a key one, and is set out very clearly in our water policy that was approved by the bank in 2021, but also our water strategy for 2021 and 2025, which clearly identifies support to countries to enhance their regulatory framework, governance, water governance, and to strengthen institutions as a key investment priority for the bank. And we are doing that in a number of the projects that we're supporting. Currently, the bank has a portfolio of over 105 projects in Africa in the sector, valued over $5 billion. So it's quite large, and we invest about $1 billion every year. But I'll give two examples of projects that are currently ongoing that have a focus on supporting improvement of regulatory frameworks. We have a project approved last year in Rwanda, Sustainable and Resilient Water and Sanitation Program, with two key reforms that are targeted there. Strengthening sector institutions to improve coordination, oversight, and ensure sustainable sector performance, but also strengthening efficiency and capacity within the sector. Another project in Nigeria that's also going, valued over $120 million, is also targeting reforms, particularly institutional reforms that take prominence in that project to address some weaknesses, focusing on strengthening that institutional capacity and taking reforms to improve the overall sector efficiency. These are but only two examples. Definitely more needs to be done, and we need to find a way how we can all collaborate to achieve more and ensure that strong and effective regulatory frameworks and institutions support the mobilization of increased investments into the sector. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you very good deliberations today in this webinar. We'll listen to some presentations, and we have an able panel that will discuss the key issues. But I'd like to welcome you to feel free, encourage you to participate, engage actively in the discussion so that we have a successful webinar and useful outcomes coming out of it that can inform how we can improve the sector and identify opportunities to scale up. With these remarks, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and hand back to the moderator to continue with the agenda for the day. So back to you, Joanne.
Thank you so much, Mr. Michera, for those wonderful remarks. And as you've rightly said, the sector is really lagging behind in terms of attracting finance. So just to kick us off with the presentations, as you've rightly said as well, I'd like now to invite Adrian Wilson, who is a specialist from Wilton and Associates International, to present on the high-level assessment that was conducted that you have mentioned, and he will be able to just share on the sector financial planning, the finance frameworks and insights from the high-level study that was conducted jointly. So Adrian, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Joan. Can you see this presentation? Can you see those slides, everybody?
Yes, from my end, I think they're very clear.
Okay, great. Morning, afternoon, evening, colleagues. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present on this this quite strategic and I think very challenging and for me eye-opening project. Just an overview of what I'm going to talk about, just a little bit about the process that we followed. Then I'm going to expand a bit on this sector finance planning conceptual framework that we worked through and developed. On this project, as you mentioned earlier, Emmanuel was very much involved and very much an instigator, and then also working with Yvonne from SOS. So the three of us kind of worked as a team on it. And then part of the study was to, I'm not going to go through the TOR in detail, but in essence, the idea was to look at sector finance, water sector finance in 3 countries as sort of case studies, to understand the overall mechanics and dynamics and how the different building blocks sort of fit together. And then later on, flowing from that to look at then, you know, what role can the excuse me, can the sector regulators play in this? Excuse me. Can they influence things? They're obviously very key players. They're influenced by all sorts of other dynamics which are going on in terms of finance, in the utilities, and in other respects. And then to then, as I say, look at recommendations coming out of that. Yvonne is going to pick up on that side. I'm going to deal more with what came out of the broader sort of assessment and looking at the model. And then I'll pick up very briefly looking at what came out from the 3 countries. Just to caveat that this was 2022, 2023, so it's slightly out of date. I'm sure some things have changed. That's the nature of things. And yeah, let me also say by way of introduction, I must say, you know, all of us, I think a lot of us as colleagues, we're involved in a lot of these planning and strategic and sector finance things in some respects or other. But sometimes it's difficult when you're inside the system to actually see the whole big picture and try and work out some of the puzzling things which are happening. So that for me was useful to take a bit more of a helicopter view to understand this overall model and kind of mechanisms. So I mentioned when the study was carried out, there's as usual, there was a reasonably extensive literature search and reviews, quite a lot of good material out there, you know, particularly, you know, this is on sector financial planning, particularly from the OECD, UNICEF. There's quite a lot of World Bank stuff. And of course, a lot of stuff are good stuff in the 3 countries as well. We then developed an instrument, a questionnaire, because what we did is set up and conducted a lot of interviews in each of the 3 countries, targeting decision makers, senior people in the sector, to get an understand what things what was going on. Then from there, we looked at developing the model, drawing on what comes out of the literature, and then the missions, and then consolidating that into the reports. So first of all, the model. So the first building block in this is the sector investment framework. And many of you, I think, will recognize this. Many countries have done it. Not all countries have done it. And some have probably, fair to say, done better jobs than others. But that's basically setting out the needs of the sector. And typically it will consist of some of these, some or all of these things. You know, a lot of programs and projects, hopefully supported by adequate due diligence for those so that they can stand up to scrutiny. And typically it would include some kind of financial model so that you can analyze different scenarios. So step 2 in this is the sector funding strategy, which, you know, then looks at the finance sources for the sector. And that would include the typical 3 T's, taxes, transfers, and tariffs. And this would also include a financial model, so that scenarios can be analyzed. And importantly here, ideally, this should not just be about CapEx. It should also include OpEx and CapManEx as well. So that otherwise you're not understanding the whole picture. You're not picking up on sustainability and funding, servicing loans and funding, which is coming back to the utilities and back to the system. So that's in an ideal scenario. It's fair to say that, for what I've picked up in literature is and from the observation is that, many countries do this pretty well. They don't necessarily do that aspect as well. So then some question marks. There's an obvious gap here. And I think we will all recognize this when I speak to it. There's something missing here. And that is the policy step 3, the policy and strategy review. And why do we need that? Well, it's very simple. These two things never equate. So in some ways, this by itself is sometimes, I'm not being insulting here, but this one without two can be a wish list, because if you don't have the funding strategy support it, then the logic is not there. But because these rarely, there's always more needs than funding available. So then there has to be then this sort of ability to review, carry out this sort of strategic policy review and say, okay, what trade-offs are we going to make to achieve this? And then you get the feedback to say, oh no, we actually need to shift some targets. We need to rethink our strategy, because that's the reality check. As I say, that those things are nearly always out of kilter, sadly. And that is the traditional SFP, sector financial planning. I prefer it to call it strategic sector financial planning personally, but that's in the literature, those 3 steps. So we've added 2 extra things which we thought were very important in this conceptual, this model or framework. The first one is what we call the sector finance monitoring mechanism. And that really is looking at picking up the information through the sort of project life cycle in terms of all, all the projects and expenditure, and ideally feedback loops in terms of operating costs and tariffs and collections and all of that, and then tracking that and then evaluating that. Oh, and so I'm sorry, one other thing I must say, there's another reality check here. The literature says, and we need to be very, very honest here, that the literature says there's almost no countries that does this really well. So this is not, if you're looking at this and saying, well, we're nowhere near this, or we're doing well on it, or whatever. There's almost no countries. This is not a developing country sort of syndrome. There's almost no countries apparently that do this very well. So yeah, that we thought was a very important thing. And again, there seems to be the 3 countries I looked at are not doing this element particularly well. And again, generally, it seems to be a gap, a significant gap. So this sector finance monitoring mechanism, the idea of that is it's some kind of clearinghouse for monitoring all sector finance, capturing information on sector spend, ideally including all the key players, bearing this in mind, there's a lot of players. You've obviously got national governments, depending on the constitution of the country, regional governments can be playing a key role, spending a lot of money. There's utilities, there's development partners, there's NGOs and charitable foundations. And this is difficult. I think most of you will testify that. To try and get information on all of this is not easy. So this is a big challenge for all of us, I think, going forward. Realistically, initially, even if one could start getting a better handle on all the CapEx spend and understanding that, and then later on, perhaps looking at the OpEx elements. But even if one can really get a handle on CapEx initially, and tracking and evaluating it, getting a feedback loop, how well is it being spent? Is it hitting the target? Did it meet its original objectives? That kind of thing. And then, this then provides a very good feedback loop to all of this. Is this other stuff working? You're getting that feedback from that. And then the other thing we really thought was crucial in an ideal world was a sector-wide approach, because there's just so many players involved here in many countries. The countries that I work in, there's just so many players that to try and do this, even, if it's just government or it's just the water sector, or you're not involving the key ministries or the development partners or all sorts of other players. So we know these things are more complicated, but I think that is the reality. Just some very high level feedback on what came out from the countries. So it's at that time it was apparent that some really good work had been done on SIP, sector investment plans, and there was one of these in each country. So the NOAA SIP in Kenya, the SIP in Zambia, and the SSIP in Uganda. So that was, and this, that seemed to be some really solid work on that. But the next step 2, the sector funding strategies, at that time, I couldn't really pick up that was really being done very effectively. To be fair, there seemed to be, the best example seemed to be in Kenya. There did seem to be some very high level discussions and consideration of that, and even the policy strategy review element was being discussed. When I was in Kenya, I think this thing was hot off the press and it hadn't really been disseminated, I think, very widely. So it would be interesting, for some of our Kenyan colleagues to maybe give an update on that. And indeed, in Zambia and Uganda, what has happened subsequently. Anecdotally, there was a basket fund, which is quite often linked to SWAP, that had fallen away in Uganda and Kenya, but interestingly was being proposed in Zambia in the SIP. As I said, there's little evidence of the sector finance monitoring mechanism, but there was something called TrackFin, which some of you may be aware of, which I'll talk a little bit about later, which seemed to be, embryonically a good start to that. The sector-wide approach did appear to be in decline in all 3 countries. And some of the other challenges, I think everyone was talking about poor bankability of the commercial utilities, noting that there are some notable exceptions, of course. Weak due diligence processes for project planning was something which came out in all three countries, many commentators. And of course, that feeds up into the higher level things, master planning and, project planning and then national planning, strategic planning. Very high contributions by development partners to sector capex in Kenya and Zambia, less so in Uganda, interestingly. And then a close working relationship between the Ministry of Water and the Ministry of Finance in Uganda. Okay, so I just wanted to speak on that. The as much as we're all technocrats, there's always the human element to things, and again in the literature it's said that where you have that closer relationship between the ministry responsible for water and the Ministry of Finance in a country, it seems to work a lot better. The availability of finance, the communication, and things like that. So these things are not to be underestimated. I didn't pick up such as close a relationship in the other two countries. We also asked the people we interviewed just to give a subjective view on these questions. How do you rate sector coordination? How do you rate management of sector finance? And how do you rate effectiveness of sector finance spend? And the decision makers in the sector and the senior people were all giving us numbers somewhere in the region of 4 to 6. So, and it did vary. There were sort of trends in the different countries as well. Some countries slightly better than other, but it indicates, there's opportunities for improvement in this area. There's a lot that can be done. A few other things, and Mary and Iskandar, I've been a bit naughty. I've just slipped in a few extra slides, so excuses for that. I mean, apologies for that. So, and very quickly, and we don't have time probably to discuss this, but a thing that you often find in the sector is that you'll have a certain amount of funding earmarked at a national level, at a strategic level, which will look like that. But then once you've been through a budgeting process, it becomes a smaller amount here. But then later on, when the funding is dispersed, it actually gets smaller again. And then you often have a problem with absorption rate by the institution. So, whereas you're originally thinking of this big chunk of money up here, eventually what actually gets spent is down here. And that's a big challenge for the sector. And then, as I say, the project life cycle, I mean, people in all three countries said the whole due diligence thing is problematic. There's a lot can be improved. So there's capacity building and additional work needed to make this better, to professionalize it more. And I mean, that's a conventional project life cycle. But if you start bringing in bilaterals, it gets substantially more complicated. So now you've got even more steps. So that obviously slows things up, and there's a lot more work to do for everyone. Just quickly on the track fin, this was taking place in Kenya, and then to a lesser extent in Uganda, and I was impressed with what they were trying to do. I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I understand. I think it was originally developed by WHO, by the World Health Organization, and then there are various players involved in Kenya, but I think USAID was one of them that was supporting it. So they're trying to understand what's the total expenditure in the sector. How are funds distributed between these different types, CapEx, O&M, etc.? who pays for services, what entities are the main channels of funding. It doesn't address the issues like effectiveness. So it's not that sector finance monitoring mechanism concept, but it is nevertheless a significant step towards that, I think. So, I mean, these are just figures from what came out in Kenya, but interesting that you're getting some pretty good information around sector investment costs, O&M, support or software costs, and other costs as well. And then also, it's then broken down into all sorts of different areas. So where's the money? Where is, as they say, follow the money. So this is the served users. The money collected from them is the biggest chunk, which is interesting. And then you've got the money from development partners, county governments, national governments, civil society, etc. So that's interesting information. Then again, we don't have time to discuss this, but this concept of the sector finance monitoring mechanism, you've got these broader issues as well. This is a whole probably webinar all by itself, looking at national information systems for the sector and national M&E systems as well. So the evolution, my conclusions at the end, which I think are in the study, is it's still in its early stages, sector financial planning or strategic sector financial planning. There's some good work that's been done in the SIPs in the 3 countries. Sector coordination, there's a lot that can be done, and this is not what I'm saying. This is how people rated it. When we asked them to, give that subjective score. And the same applies to the management and monitoring. And there's a lot of opportunities there to improve things. Decline in swap. And I mean, another sort of detail within this was that when I asked those rating questions, generally government officials rated it higher than other officials. And I'm not saying that in a critical way. I think it's probably an issue of perceptions, and also of course the government officials have to make the right impression, and in terms of how things are going in the sector and how things are doing. Just lastly, one last thing. I think it's important this is really big strategic stuff, So, and I think we're only skating the surface today, but you could easily have a webinar or even a series of webinars on a sector funding strategy, for example. This policy and strategic review, the sector finance monitoring mechanism, and even other things as well. So I hope that's been useful, and back to the chairperson or moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. And like you've rightly said, I think it would be of great consideration to look at how to break down the conceptual framework with all the various subsections within. So we were supposed to have the presentation by Yvonne, the Executive Secretary of ESAWAS Regulators Association. However, I will have to make the presentation on her behalf. So please bear with me as I proceed to just share my screen. Please let me know if you can see my screen. Please confirm you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. So just jumping in to provide some insights on the role that regulation plays in the financing, in the sector financing framework for the water supply and sanitation sector with regard to investment, funding, planning, and implementation monitoring. I will go ahead and present on behalf of Yvonne. So just going back to what Mr. Michera said, that there is need to scale up investment for the water and sanitation sector. It's been largely proven that the water sector, despite its severe stress and the need to have improved water service delivery, there is deficiency in the investment within the sector. So we are deficient in terms of the investment that is coming into the sector. So looking at the scenario, currently we have an estimated 6.7 trillion that is expected by 2030 and even more, 22.6 trillion by 2050. When you go down to country level, you're looking at the water sector, water supply and sanitation policies, and just trying to understand, are they actually supporting the national strategic or investment plans? That could be a yes, that could be a no, depending on which country you're in. And so this means that there is need to have, there's need to improve and to mobilize additional investment from public and private sources, some of which Mr. Michera also mentioned. So we really do have a lot of loopholes when it comes to mobilizing and attracting finance for the sector. So looking at the Africa Sun and Goal Commitments Monitoring Report of 2023, under Commitment 2, you find that they were monitoring the degree to which member states have mobilized high-level support and resources for sanitation hygiene. However, this image that you are now looking at just shows you the extent to which member states are actually tracking budgets and allocations for sector financing. And you can see that...
Joan, sorry,
yes, please.
your slides are not moving. Sorry.
Is it moving now?
No, you're still on slide 1. I don't know. Are other people seeing other slides, or is it still slide 1?
Yeah, it's still slide 1.
Still slide 1 as well.
Okay. Mary, do you mind sharing your screen?
Yeah, I can try.
Okay. But do let me know if it's now moving. Yes, Mary, please put in full screen and go to the next, go to the 4th slide. Kindly put in full screen. Great. So as I was saying, good. So Yvonne is online, so she can take over. Thank you so much.
Do I need to stop sharing?
You can continue to share.
Okay.
Mary, please enable Yvonne to be able to speak.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you for the introduction. Yeah. Thank you, Mary. And apologies for that technical hiccup. Yeah, so to continue from where Joanne had started, looking at the financial reporting for the sector, when you look at the Africa Sun Goal Commitments Report from 2023, it clearly shows that very few countries are actually tracking expenditure. And this was specific to sanitation and hygiene, but it gives the extent of the problem with regards to tracking budgets and expenditure with regards to water supply and sanitation. Next slide, please. So Adrian has gone through the sector finance conceptual framework. So you have to do the arrows for me, Mary. The first part of the sector investment framework, you can just press for the next one, quantifies the sector investment needs over a significant period of time. The second, which is sector funding strategy, quantifies the capital and the operating costs. The third, which is sector policy and strategy review, addresses the core policy and strategy choices of the sector. Then the fourth part, which is looking at the sector finance monitoring mechanism, is looking really at how we monitor the investments in the sector, all the way from what is captured to the evaluation. So it's the baseline information to assess the effectiveness of the spend on various types of projects. Then the last part, which is the sector-wide approach, focuses on the collaboration, coordination, and alignment and information sharing. So within this, the question is, what is the role of the regulator? So with regards to regulation itself, we have seen that where regulation has been implemented, there is an increase in the investments that have been going into the sector. So just looking very briefly at Kenya, for example, from the time the regulator was put in place, that is somewhere around 2006, Kenya is in purple. You can see how investments have increased over time to demonstrate the confidence that has gone into the sector with the existence of regulation. So regulators themselves are policy implementers, and they focus on universal access. This means non-discrimination of services, with implementation of accountability and transparency. And also they're able to define acceptable levels of service. This means setting the quality levels against affordability levels. And also there's need to consider innovative approaches to funding beyond the tariff. The regulator is generally known for the tariff, so we can look at other sources of funds, which include basket funds, creditworthiness, and so on. You can move to the next slide. So in terms of the role of the regulator within the finance conceptual framework, when we look at sector policies and strategies, regulators themselves are policy implementers. So there is need for regulators to be able to link sector policy and strategy with the financing needs and approaches. So regulators can play this role, and they can produce even policy briefs. In Zambia, for example, within the sector performance report that is produced annually, they are able to show to what extent policy has actually been implemented. But we need to reach a stage where we are also demonstrating how the financing needs have been met against that policy and against the sector strategies, which the regulator can also advise on prioritization of finance during budgeting, especially with scarce resources. So the regulator has got oversight of what the utilities need, where the gaps are, where the shortfalls of the tariff are, and can then advise on where the priorities for finance that is available, where that should be directed. Then under the sector investment framework, I'm still on the same slide, thank you. Under the sector investment framework, the regulators can support sector financial analysis. So looking at the comparison of costs with regards to appropriate technology, with regards to the benefits. So this is usually the role of the regulator when they are looking at the tariffs. But beyond the tariffs, other investments that are coming into the sector, whether it's government or development partners or commercial lending, there should be somewhere where you can see this comparison of the costs. What is needed for CapEx, for capital expenditure, what is needed for operational expenditure, and do some sort of scenario analysis to maximize the impact of investments at the end of the day. Then regulators in some countries, for example, in Kenya, are able to set guidelines for investments. So how that is integrated within the regulatory process helps to guide prioritization of assets to be developed, clarifies the ownerships of assets. We have in some countries asset holders which are separated from the operations of the utilities, but there is an impact at the end of the day on the repayment of debt that is financed from the assets. So how that all is dealt with needs to be properly guided for the sector. And we feel this is the role that the regulator can play. Then there's a sector funding strategy where the regulator can support financial risk assessments to be able to have sustainable financing for service delivery. How do we assess risks and ensure that they are dealt with? Then the regulator can also support data-driven investment planning, where in most countries, investment plans are actually a regulatory requirement. But we need to strengthen the bottom-up planning, what data utilities are using, and how credible those are. So investing in data system strengthening is so key to ensuring that even the finance requirements are responding to what the sector actually needs. Of course, the regulator needs to be able to be open to the sector being able to get funding beyond the tariff. So how do we achieve this? What guidelines are in place? How is the creditworthiness of utilities assessed, for example? Is there a creditworthiness index for water supply and sanitation utilities to be able to access other sources of finance, which comes to the PPPs, for example? And we have learned in some countries like in Tanzania, where they're using a revenue sharing approach under PPPs. What role does the regulator play? So the regulator can promote the consideration of all these different forms of finance by setting the rules and establishing the systems to encourage it. Then the creditworthiness I've touched on, so we can move to the next one. Next slide. Under sector finance, the regulator should be able to track government commitments. As we have said, the regulator is a policy implementer. So it should be able to check government has committed so much to the sector. What has actually been achieved and what has actually changed in the sector? Do we have KPIs that allow us to track that? That should be in place. Then the regulators can also analyze spending trends across the different sources of finance. So this is the monitoring mechanism. So having this in place, detailed, disaggregated, according to specific allocations, according to what has been spent, and the final change that has happened. Have we managed to increase water coverage? Have we managed to increase sanitation coverage? Have the hours of supply gone up? Because we have invested so much in ABCD. That tracking needs to be done at that top level. Then the regulators can also support implementation of these integrated sector systems to be able to link targets, inputs, outputs, and outcomes to the investment, as I've just said. So having these systems embedded at the national level, within the ministry level, for example, would help to have an integrated approach to tracking what is happening in the sector. And finally, under SWAP, we say the regulator should be a key participant and contributor in sector and interministerial coordination groups. So this will allow more effective and synergistic use of resources, and also foster transparency in how funds are being spent, because they are discussed at a level that has that transparency, and also develop capacity. This is very important. We talk of bankable institutions, but who is leading this within the countries? What does bankable mean for water supply and sanitation utilities. They need to be capacitated. Just project preparation is a challenge. So all this can be taken care of within the ambit of regulation and stronger accountability. So the end goal for the regulators, next slide, is to move from a point of the cost of non-compliance, which is an ineffective sector, losing so much of the investment that is being put in through various areas of poor performance, to a situation where the sector is well managed. Just press say next. Yes. So we move from that poor performing situation to a well-performing sector with well-run utilities, well-resourced regulators, well-resourced utilities, to be able to transform the sector to where it should be and maintain these quality standards with universal access for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for your presentation. I think it's very clear that the regulator provides plays a very important role, providing oversight. The regulator is supposed to be a policy implementer, so they need to take this role very critically. And I think for me as well, just trying to ensure that that countries have guidelines in place to access, to be able to attract and access other sources of financing. Thank you for your presentation. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Eskendir Demisi to moderate the panel session and go on to the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you, Joan. I think we have heard very excellent presentations from Yvonne and Adrian, covering wide topics, especially the sector funding planning aspect, which gives a conceptual framework together with building blocks. And it's quite also interesting how Yvonne, encapsulated the role of, regulators in sector, financing. With this, we have very distinguished panelists for this session. I'll just quickly introduce them. Ms. Angela Kimani from Water Services Regulator Board. Ms. Angela is, she has got a 15 years experience in regulation. She pioneered indexation of water and sewerage tariff in Kenya and has been instrumental in putting water utilities on a sustainable path. Our second panelist is Engineer Sipuma Ruben, Regional Policy and Regulatory Lead from the Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor. He manages the Zambia program as well as 5 other programs in East Africa. He has over 24 years professional experience in governance, policy, regulation, design, managing delivery of financially viable and equitable water supply and sanitation services. Our third panelist is Ms. Chola Kasoma Mbilima, Senior Inspector, Financial and Commercial Management from the National Water Supply and Sanitation Council. She has over 18 years, experience. She's specialized in economic and incentive regulation, governance, skills development, benchmarking, strategic planning, integrity management, and gender mainstreaming. She has spearheaded the development of data systems to enhance decision-making in water supply and sanitation sector. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Lazarus Firi, a Principal Water Supply and Sanitation Engineer at the African Development Bank. He's a seasoned water and sanitation practitioner with over 20 years experience in planning, design, implementation, and management of multi-sectoral, high-impact, transformative, water projects, and he has experience in working with multiple multilateral and bilateral agencies. So with these four panelists, I'll go straight to questions. My first question will be to Lazarus Firi. And I just would like to, for participants, to what extent does the quality of legal and regulatory framework determine investment in water supply and sanitation services? Lazarus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eskende, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. And thank you, Eskende, for that question and also the discussions that we've had. The presentations from Joanne has been very ice-breaking. So in terms of quality legal and regulatory framework and also vis-a-vis investment in water supply and sanitation services, there are several areas that we can look into as being influenced by this quality legal and regulatory framework. A good legal and regulatory framework would bring attractiveness of the sector to the investors, as it brings stability and clarity in the sector. A well-defined and stable legal framework will reduce uncertainty for investors and make it a bit favorable for the investors. As such, clear regulations and the predictable enforcement mechanisms will make it easier for investors to assess their risks and also returns, and thereby encouraging investments. Some investments might hinge on property rights. This might include issues of water rights or innovations. So once we have a good and practical regulatory framework, this will ensure investors that the investments and innovations will be secure from arbitrary changes or any exploitation that might come along the way. Also, looking at issues of tariff setting and quality standards, an effective regulation of the tariffs would ensure that we have prices that reflect the true cost of providing water and sanitation services. And this will allow financial sustainability of the services and encourage investment. You all agree that poor regulated tariffs might normally discourage investments if they are set too low and thereby impacting issues of sustainability, revenue collection, and profitability, which are very key elements that are considered in investment decisions. In terms of governance and transparency also, this is a very key element of a very good regulatory framework, as it will promote openness and accountability and enhance investor confidence. So, for example, if you have a legal framework that addresses issues of corruption and brings out about issues of accountability, the confidence of the investors to invest in the sector is going to be high. And these are very key also in decision-making for investment in the sector. Issues of institutional capacity should be properly addressed in a good regulatory framework, and this will also bring about well-resourced and capable institutions that can better manage and oversee water and sanitation investments and water and sanitation projects. We are all aware that the window of investments now is hinging towards private and public partnerships. These also hinge on a very good framework for the PPPs. And a good and robust regulatory framework should be supportive and provide the proper legal framework for private and public partnerships, and that can facilitate investments. This might include the laws and regulations that would define the responsibilities, issues of risk sharing between the public entities and the private investors, as well as enforcement of contracts that will be generated that can really enforce when there are issues of disputes, so that they can be resolved fairly and efficiently. Lastly, I'll talk on the end of financing. A good and legal framework and regulatory framework would ensure an availability of efficiency of financial mechanisms that will include maybe it might be loans or grants, and these might be influenced by legal and regulatory framework, which can be supportive framework to facilitate access to financing for the water and sanitation sector. So yeah, in summary, I would say that the quality of a legal and regulatory framework will significantly impact in investments in water supply and sanitation services through influencing investor confidence, financial viability, and also in project execution. The framework might also support stability and clear roles in terms of effective governance and transparent processes for investments. Thank you very much, Eskend.
Thank you very much, Lazarus. I think, as you alluded, countries with clear, stable, transparent, and strong regulatory oversight frameworks have a better chance of channeling higher levels of investment into the sector. Now I will address my second question to Ms. Angela Kimani from WASREB. If you put on your video, thank you. WASREB is responsible for evaluating and recommending water and sewerage tariffs. How does WASREB balance consumer protection with the need to ensure adequate financing for water providers? Thank you very much.
Thank you, moderator. I also appreciate the presentation by Adrian and Yvonne and the panelist who's gone before me and has elaborated on the regulatory frameworks. Indeed, it's been a very enlightening discussion. Maybe to just dive into the question regarding the intersection between financing water service providers sustainably and consumer protection. Indeed, when you look at the Water Act 2016 that establishes the regulator, I hope I'm loud enough, am I? Yeah. When you look at the Water Act 2016 that establishes WASREB, the principal objective of its establishment is to protect the rights and interests of consumers in the provision of water services. Yet the same act is one which has bestowed upon WASREB the responsibility to evaluate and recommend water services tariffs. So the regulator actually balances the interests of the consumers and the interests of the water service providers in terms of sustainability. Getting into how WASREB gets to do this is that our actions are actually rotate around the right to water. The right to water entitles everyone to have access to sufficient, safe, acceptable, accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic use. Yet, going by the discussion that has gone on before this, is that tariffs are the most reliable and most predictable sources of financing for water utilities. So in this case, WASREB approves the tariffs with the objective of ensuring that the utilities cover their justified costs. This covers both the operations and maintenance costs and also the capex. Adrian, who in his presentation alluded to sometimes we focus a lot on, during the investment planning, we focus a lot on the capital cost and we forget the O&M. But what we do at WASREB is that we ensure that the level of service is maintained by ensuring that the tariffs cover the operation and maintenance costs, and then the capex to come in and replace the old assets, expand service delivery, renew assets, etc., and also to take interventions such as the efficient interventions such as the reduction of non-revenue water and improving maybe collection efficiency and so on. So to do this, we ensure that these tariffs are reviewed from time to time. Typically, we do it in a period of between 3 and 5 years. Each tariff period goes for about 3 to 5 years, depending on the water service provider. And then we ensure that these tariffs are able to, at a minimum, the very bare minimum is to maintain a good level of service. But the best scenario is where we have the water utilities using the tariffs to improve the quality of service. This is hours of supply, water quality, waste management treatment, etc., and increase access to underserved areas. So this approach ensures that the consumers are protected on aspects of sufficiency, safety, and access to access under the right of water. But there's another important aspect in terms of consumer protection. There's the affordability aspect. While WASREB allows the water service providers to recover all the justified costs, how does WASREB make sure that the consumer is protected from exploitation and also gets value for what they're paying for? Like I have alluded to, is that the first thing is that the costs allowed for tariffs by WASREB must be justified costs. It must be the cost that is going to deliver the best quality service at the most efficient cost. So we also look at the issue of the poor. How can they, what can they afford in terms of how much they pay for their bills for water and sewerage? So when we're setting the tariffs, we rely a lot on the affordability studies, which are carried out by the water service providers, and WASREB validates these studies to ensure that the proposed tariffs actually cater for all the socioeconomic bands of the society. And with this, we ensure that there's a lifeline tariff that enables the poorest of the poor to access the first 6 units at a cost that is typically lower than the required cost of production. And this is how this cost is covered is through cross-subsidy. Also, we ensure that in areas where there are not enough household connections, in the case of my country, Kenya, we find that not everyone has a household connection. But what WASREB does through the tariffs is to ensure that the tariffs for the water kiosks, the ones who serve the underserved areas, have tariffs that are highly subsidized, and the consumers are able to access the water services in portable containers of about 20 liters at an affordable cost. So in this way, we are able to cover all these aspects of the right to water in terms of affordability, sufficiency, safety, and access. And that is how WASREB takes care of consumer interests in tariff setting. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kimani. I think it is good that you brought, to us one of, I think, the major, I think in some countries constitutional, and in some countries it is in the legislation, the right to, access to water. And it's very interesting to see how you balance, the consumer interest and also, utilities, viability in terms of, recovering their, their costs to do for efficient, operation and maintenance, and also, capital, cost. Thank you very much. Our third panelist is Ms. Ms. Chola Imbilima from NAWASCO. And my question will be, how can policymakers, utilities, regulators collaborate to enhance financial modeling and asset management within the sector with proper tracking and accountability for investment? This takes us back to the conceptual framework. And if you could a little bit unpack this, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody. So, yes.
You are mute.
I think this issue of some form of, yes, it requires quite some great deal of coordination between the different sector players. And I think that the regulator should actually play the role of steering up this coordination between the governments, who are the policymakers, and the service providers, including also the partners that tend to bring in the resources. Now, how do they do that? I want to get back to the conceptual frameworks that was highlighted earlier by the presenters. When you look at the issue of investment planning, in there, I see the role of the regulator it needs to be strengthened in that sometimes when you look at the plans that countries have, you realize that the information that is put in there was not backed by evidence. Maybe the data itself was not adequate to back up some of these investment needs that have been articulated. And I think that the role of the regulator there is to make sure that sectors have got robust data systems, such that when you are coming up with a plan, an investment plan, you are able to justify it with data. And regulators need to really take up that role seriously. I know that most of us regulators are getting into that aspect because it's been quite a gap. So if you look at plans and you analyze them, you realize that maybe there was not sufficient data to come up with the investment requirements that have been articulated. Also, when you look at the finances themselves and where these finances need to be drawn from, you find that regulators, again, have a very serious role to play. So when you look at sector funding strategies, the strategy itself, it's not a matter of putting text together. You need to look at the revenues themselves. Where are these revenues going to come from? And from the earlier speakers, you will note that regulators have a role in revenue generation aspects of service providers. In that, they approve tariffs, that's one aspect, but also they need to guide in terms of private sector participation issues. They need to guide in terms of grants, loans. They can also guide in terms of taxes, government funding, on budget funding. So that actually is a very, very critical role that regulators need to enhance. And they need to really see how that is well coordinated among the different stakeholders. I need to mention that sometimes we get to a point where, let me just say, all these stakeholders that you've mentioned, or in one way or the other, are culprits in not coordinating. I'll start with the partners. The partners, you find that sometimes they have their priorities already set from wherever. So they come and engage and tell you, oh, we want to bring in so much money, whether a grant or a loan, and this is where we want to put it. Now, whether or not governments, regulators, and other stakeholders within that particular country have had a say is something that we need to explore further. But I think that from that point, we need to have that coordination between the stakeholders. The money is here. This is the money that is there. Where can it work best? Somebody needs to do the prioritization. And I think regulators can support in that because they have an overview of what is going on And remember that one of their roles is that they need to support in terms of reporting and tracking some of these investments. So they know where the need lies. And so the issue of prioritization actually sits with them, and they can guide where these resources can make the most impact. So in terms of developing these strategies for funding, I think the aspect of prioritization needs to be critically looked at. And in doing that, I think coordination needs to be enhanced among the different stakeholders. Of course, we realize that stakeholders have got their objectives. They want to meet certain objectives. Government want to meet objectives. Funding partners want to meet objectives. Utilities also may have their own objectives. But we need to converge and say, where do we put this? And that is where the aspect of coordination actually becomes very important. The other aspect is when the resources are available, you know, limited as they may be, who is tracking the usage? Who is making sure that we are getting the impact on the ground? Again, we need to enhance coordination in that area, because most of the times we see that money comes into sectors, it's invested. At the end of the day, as regulators, remember, we produce reports that show us what we've done as a sector. Where are we on coverage? Where are we on meeting government aspirations? But that usually is not linked to the financing that went into achieving some of those things. So we need to coordinate there. If this money is meant to save this particular area, has it saved that area? And it has to start from, did the money come through? Was it utilized for the intended purpose? If it was utilized for the intended purpose, have we achieved the objectives of that particular purpose? So those are some of the things where I think that the issues of coordination need to be enhanced between or among the different stakeholders. But I want to emphasize two things, that issues of data systems, because we need really to have evidence in our planning. I think that is one area where coordination is required, and it's not very well done at the moment. And I also want to emphasize the issue of tracking resources. Where are the resources going? Have they actually been disbursed? I know governments can be culprits in some instances, so they will commit monies which they never disburse. So who's tracking, who's making sure that this money is actually on the ground? And what are the outcomes that we've achieved? Have we obtained the impact? So that we see the sectors moving, as opposed to having a situation where you get money coming in and there's no proper prioritization. We don't get the results that we want to get at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Milimba. I think without further ado, let me proceed to Engineer Ruben Sipuma, mindful of the constraint of time that we have, and we'll ask you to be, very brief. The question is, in what ways can regulators influence and improve the sector-wide approach to planning in the water sector? Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Eskedia, and the previous panelist. I think for that particular question, I want to look at the aspect of what are the fundamentals for the swap. I think we all are alive to the fact that it entails that government has leadership from planning to implementation until we achieve the desired impact. But also that planning should lie within the government framework of a particular country. And also taking note of the institutional capacities to be able to undertake the level of planning, and also the need for flexibility on the part of those that are supporting. These could be development partners or other players within the sector. Having said that, on the other hand, we see that regulators, as we've read through and through, regulators are technical advisors to government, and at the same time, they're also policy implementers. So what that entails, for instance, one of the key challenges we've seen is the issue of capacity within, for instance, service providers and other key government delivery entities. So there is need for the regulator, because the regulator is closer to these service providers and they know some of the key capacity issues within these institutions. So from the regulator side, I think they have the ability to be able to help these institutions build these capacities by partnering also with other supporters, so that once the capacities are built, then we can be able to utilize that and be able to have planning that reflect the SWAP approach. But also, I think the other aspect is that regulators must promote best practices that have shown to have had wider impact. For instance, if I give an example of what NWASCO has done, for instance, is the issue of when we are transitioning to on-site sanitation. They've been assisting commercial utilities to be able to do their sanitation mapping for the purposes of understanding better the magnitude of the needs or the demand, which then informs the planning. So in this case, the extent to which the regulator promotes best practices such as this one or many others, I think will better improve the coordination and also the planning as the regulator is supporting such service providers. But there's also the aspect of, and sometimes we underrate this is the political economy, and particularly the politicians. The regulator has opportunity to create that awareness and understanding so that politicians appreciate the magnitude of challenges and planning that has gone in, so that during implementation, they can be able to support. Because sometimes we have situations where, as a result of not being aware of the importance of such implementation, you have counter messaging, which downplays the level of implementation that, for instance, utilities may be implementing. So in this case, I think regulators have an opportunity to be able to create that understanding within the politicians and help them to appreciate and support the regulator as well. So I think in terms of what can regulators influence and improve as regards sector-wide approach to planning, I think those are the few points that I had, a moderator.
Thank you very much, Engineer Ruben. I think collaboration, among stakeholders in the sector. I think the water and sanitation sector is, complex. A lot of the sectoral activities, they lie in different ministries, different service providers, and also, with the level of, decentralization and the delegation of, authorities, it lies at, different levels. And also there are, in parallel, multiple, stakeholders that has, crucial interest in advancing the water sector. So collaborating and, working together, planning, the sector jointly is an essential element to, I think, assist in terms of mobilizing more resources, and regulators can play a sizable role in this particular aspect. Joanne, I think we have 5-10 minutes just to go through some of the questions.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. I think there are some questions in the questions section, and one of the questions is, what remedies would you propose to deal with the observed weak due diligence process for project planning? I'll link this question to another one. What were the consequences of weak diligence in the 3 countries? I think maybe Adrian, could you come in on this question?
Could you repeat that, Eskinder? Could you repeat the question?
What are the observed weak due diligence processes for project planning in the 3 countries? And what is the consequence of that?
Yeah, as I said earlier, the due diligence at project level and program level basically feeds up into that national level planning, the sector financial planning and the SIPs. So, and I think other speakers referred to that, Chola referred to it as well, is that if that information is not solid down at the lower level, then it means that the national investment plan doesn't have that credibility, and I mean that's at a strategic level and yeah, I mean I can't quantify this because my studies are more sort of anecdotal in terms of the information in the 3 countries. But the other obvious thing at a project level is just not securing funding, because when you talk about that project life cycle, either things don't get approved or they become even more convoluted. I mean, that flow diagram I showed where you've got development partners, where you've got a lot of extra steps, 15 or 20 steps. That's long anyway. If you then have things which get sent back or rejected, do another loop, then it becomes even longer. Those are my quick comments, Eskinder.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adrian. Another question. In Uganda, the sector has moved away from a swap approach as part of a much wider cross-government shift to programmatic approach within the framework of the NDP3. How has this affected financial planning for the water sector, urban and rural? I think who can take this question? Adrian, can you take this?
Yeah, I'll make an initial comment, but it would be interesting to get comments from maybe other Ugandan colleagues. I noticed this was going on. This debate was going on when I was in Uganda, and it was very interesting because the approach, the government as a whole, seemed to be, as you say, moving much more away from a sector approach to, and I can't remember the term they used, but they were using like clusters. So they were either saying, no, this project or program involves several, it's not just water. It involves these 4 or 5 ministries. Now, obviously, there's a lot of merit in that approach, and I think at that stage it was too early to say how that was panning out. But the downside, and I know people were in the sector there were saying to me, they're just a bit worried that the importance of the sector may get downplayed. So, Yeah, as I say, it'll be interesting to see. I think the jury is still out on that. I can't comment anymore. It'd be interesting to hear what other Ugandan colleagues say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Just going through the questions. One question maybe to Yvonne. Securing funding for WASH in rural and small town context is also important, but challenging. Are there any activities you see as particularly important for regulators with a mandate covering rural and small town contexts?
Thank you. I would like to ask Chola to answer that because they have direct experiences with small cities and rural. Chola?
Thank you very much, Yvonne. So yes, indeed, to answer that question, I want to first of all highlight the fact that with the urban areas that regulators are focusing on right now, we still have challenges with regard to financial sustainability of our service providers. Yet we realize the fact that if we do not embrace the rural areas right now, the story will keep going on and on. So what we as regulators are doing is to say that, yes, let these rural areas be under the umbrella of the service providers, and by so doing also being under regulation. But in terms of the modalities of how these services are to be provided in the rural areas, this is where now regulators need to be innovative and think outside the box. So in our context, for example, we are saying that resources are limited to even trickle down all the way to the rural areas. But more so, when we talk of issues of tariffs and so on, you realize that the aspects of affordability in the rural areas are more pronounced. So we are looking at other models that can assist to provide services. And as one of the things that we've been considering very strongly is the issue of private-public partnerships, where you use small public and private entities to actually run these facilities, and they report in through the service provider that is responsible for that entire area. So what that does is that it empowers the locals, because the ones that own these private entities can even be locals within that area, but it also reduces the burden on the utility to now begin to look for resources to get in there. And we have some examples from our country here, where we have some private companies that have come in, they've invested money, and they have an agreement, a contract agreement with the utility. They are providing the services. They apply for tariffs, obviously through the utility, but they get their own special tariff because they are private. And they manage the dynamics with regard to the payments and maintaining the facilities and expanding and so on and so forth. So those are some of the modalities that can be explored with regard to rural water supply and sanitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Milima. I think with this, perhaps I conclude this question and answer session. We have run, I think, out of time, the budgeted time, almost 12 minutes late. Thank you very much, panelists, for availing yourself and responding to the various questions. And thank you also participants for raising pertinent issues and questions. And some of the, I think, questions, could be, I think, answered from, from the PowerPoint presentations that will be shared from the organizers. With this, I will hand over to Joan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for moderating the panel session. And I think just to close the day, to wrap this all up, would like to invite Mr. Mekuria Asefao, who is the manager, Water Security and Sanitation, East and Southern Africa, for his closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, organizers, distinguished attendees, presenters, panelists, and moderators. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by congratulating all of you for the commitment you have shown to attend this webinar. Allow me to thank the very able presenters, Adrian Wilson, of the Wilson and Associates International Consultants, Yvonne Magawa, the Executive Secretary of SOS, the panelists, Mr. Lazarus Piri, Angela Kimani, and Chola Mimani, and Engineer Ruben, and our able moderator for a great job done. Thank you all for keenly following the webinar, raising pertinent and engaging questions and sharing experience on strengthening the regulatory role in water and sanitation sector financing. This webinar is organized by the African Development Bank in collaboration with SOS to showcase the need for strengthened policies, institutions, and regulation. In particular, the linkage to sector finance for accelerating SDGs related to water and sanitation, SDG number 6. The water sector is chronically underinvested, with current investment averaging 0.5% of GDP. This sector's unique characteristics as both a social and economic good make financing complex. Effective financial planning and management directly impacts core issues and the funding levels. Additionally, shortcomings in policy, institutional aspects, and regulatory framework further complicate financing. It is therefore our role to respond as sector leaders to these challenges. The conversations that we have today, starting looking at the broader water sector financing framework, the funding strategy, as well as the water sector policy and strategy, and also looking at the regulatory framework and its role in supporting investment in the sector, and the last debates and the insightful panel discussions will enhance our understanding of the sector finance and its impact on service provision. This webinar offered a platform to reflect on experience and the challenges in strengthening the regulatory role in water and sanitation sector financing. Going forward, the bank will continue to include important activities in the water and sanitation sector in Africa. This mainly will include the innovative financing and partnerships, including private sector participation, to increase water and sanitation access and service delivery. The bank will also assist all the regional member countries to develop or update sector policies, strategies, and action plans based on its analytical and knowledge works. By implementing its current water strategies, the African Development Bank continues to support the delivery of sustainable, resilient, and inclusive water supply, sanitation, and hygiene services through increased and smarter investments, as well as institutional capacity building to strengthen the performance of regulators and service providers. In concluding, allow me to thank the consultants who ran this study, the SOS and the bank team for an amazing work you have done. We express our gratitude to our panelists for sharing your ideas and experience. We thank our good audience and your important participation. We are grateful for the strong partnership that the African Development Bank has enjoyed with the government and the people of Kenya, Zambia, and Uganda over the years. We look forward to strengthening this partnership further as we move forward in narrowing the financing gap and ensuring water security. In concluding my remarks, I would like to thank all of you once again for your engagement and to continue to work together to enhance sustainable water supply and sanitation service provision and ensure our regional member countries attain the SDG number 6. I wish to encourage you to complete the evaluation of this training workshop that will be shared with you today, as it shall help us to shape our future capacity building activities. Once again, my congratulations to you, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mercuria. And I think with that, there's nothing more that we can add. Thank you to all the participants of today's webinar. Thank you to all the panelists, the presenters, and we wish you a good rest of the day. We will be sharing this this presentation and the recording in due course. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Joan. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Joan.